Chapter 28. Essence stormed his body, a fire that etched his veins and burnt his soul. Power thick as ambrosia and with the strength of a mountain. His heart was made of ice and filled with electricity, and his eyes were ready to burst as the pressure threatened to overwhelm him. Blood-red energy caked his spear, and as his lunge crossed the room, fear entered the Empyrean's eyes for the first time. It struck out with its double-bit axe, trying to divert Iraq's spear strike. The steel broke, bits of the axe head spraying around like a grenade as Iraq's lunge continued on and into the Empyrean. Blood geysered outward and painted the remnants of a wall behind him as Iraq slammed his shoulder into his enemy. His legs pumped as he rode the high of the essence rush, and he carried the dying Empyrean through a wall and out into the street. Bits of charred wood and plaster coated him as he picked the Empyrean up and over his head like a pennant, blood raining down to coat him as everyone stopped to stare. Iraq flung the dying Empyrean at a group of infernal soldiers, knocking them over as he roared in joy and victory. His scarred vocal cords ached as he screamed his dominance, but the rousing sense of his bloodlust began to fill the area. Essence swirling around the soldiers as they screamed and cried out, attacking with fervor. Iraq! Nibia bulldozed into him, her blood glistening black and a cut across her brow. The columns are looted. It's time to keep pushing. Scouts went ahead. There's a large group just a block over, through those houses. She stopped to point with her bloody blade. Iraq followed the steel and looked at the burning homes and beyond them. It's a reserve, Iraq. If we crack them, we can scatter everything the fuckers have in the area. Foy will be able to link with Gresson, and we can have the breathing space to enter the floating docks. Iraq nodded and trotted back to his tank, the kill notification for the Empyrean still not having come through. He clambered on and smacked the top of the tank twice and Del popped his head out. Iraq pointed at the wall of burning homes and the tank driver looked confused. Fire on them. Through them. Nibia explained. Oh, we can do that. Connie. Through those fucking houses. A wild smile lit the man's haggard face and he dropped down again as the tank lurched forward, picking up speed as it crushed through the fallen. Gun slots opened on the front and lines of needle-thing bolts raced out, peppering the remaining demons as the tank strafed them. Iraq kept his eyes open and when they passed the dying Empyrean, he leaned over and struck down with the butt of the spear, braining the creature and killing it. Anothering level alert. Iraq ignored that, he could do it later. Right now there was a wall of buildings to push through and a demon army to kill. Del was humming, the tune nearly lost in the rumble of the treads over corpses and stone. The cannon fired again and a hole appeared in the center of the line of houses. Slowly the hole collapsed, boards and timbers cracking and falling inward as Del whooped in joy. Psycho, Nibia whispered next to Iraq's side. Her spare hand was looped around a handle and she huddled in Iraq's shadow. He lifted his shield to cover her as the tank hit the burning buildings, plowing through without hesitation. Bits of wood and plaster, wiring, tiles, and other odds and ends slammed into Iraq, battering him, but he didn't budge. The rest of the squad waited as the tank demolished the house, bursting free in a spray of flung wood and into an army. They were on a wide cul-de-sac with large homes lining the court and demons everywhere. Hundreds of infernal soldiers, flesh shapers, flesh golems, and more filled the cul-de-sac. Siege weapons were laid out in neat lines and thousands of eyes turned to look at them. Oh, fuck me, Del whispered. Iraq grabbed Nibia and jumped clear of the tank, landing behind it before the demons could react. Fire, Connie. Fire. Del screamed, the slam of the hatch shattering the stunned demons out of their stupor. Small arms fire struck the tank and evaporated in a burst of flames, doing nothing more than scorching it as several squads of demons gathered around the siege engine, trying to spin it around and point at the tank. The second tank burst out of the houses, not slowing as its cannon fired into the heart of the demon formation, and then its treads were pulping demons. Connie fired and the siege engines were turned to slag, and then their tank was running forward too. Hundreds of soldiers poured through the gaps and Iraq led the charge, heading toward the thickest grouping of infernal soldiers. A commander was rallying them, whip cracking in the air above their heads. Iraq took a hop, skip, step and threw the spear, watching as the infernal commander's head blew apart. The spear went on, embedding itself in the next demon's chest. Arak drew the sword and began to lay about himself. The long blade screamed in the air, notes of madness on the breeze, as blood flowed like rivers. The handle was too thin and the blade too long, but it killed with ease. Leather armor parted like paper and demon heads rolled while freed limbs splattered to the ground. Spear strikes and bursts of hellflame rolled over him, but Arak kept on. Pain mounted, each blow bruising in force, his vision becoming red as he painted himself in black gore. A roar filled his ears as the sword cleaved and cut. Demons tried to flee, but the battlefield was too compact, their bodies wedged too tightly together. Arak's strength carried the sword through multiple demons, the supernaturally sharp blade unstoppable. Imperial soldiers fired into the panicking ranks. The tanks continued their rampage, firing their main cannons on any concentration of forces, while their smaller casters fired continuously, spraying into the crowds as they cut a bloody swath through the reserve force. Kill notifications were ringing out, levels adding as the aura of bloodlust grew and grew, soon covering a large portion of the battlefield. Imperials were frothing at the mouth as they grappled with demons half again their size, their knives rising and falling in a delirious ecstasy. The demons were running, fear ripe in the air as they tried to escape, but they were penned in by the ring of still-standing homes. Arak split a demon in twain and heard a harsh shriek split the air and burst the bubble of his aura. Imperial warriors calmed and then looked horrified at their deeds, while the ragged handful of infernal soldiers still alive tried to regroup in a house. One of the tanks fired on the house, and then the second one did as well, and then the demon army was gone. Crushed and pulped, cut and burned, they were all scattered about as the Imperials cheered out. Arak looked about for where that crying shriek had come from. There was nothing in the shrouded skies, nor on the battlefield. There was little to see at all in the smoky haze, just the burning fires and the surviving men of their mad charge. Then the cry came again, haunting and lonely, filled with scorn and hatred. It sent chills down his spine and rose the hairs on his neck. Arak looked toward the entrance of the cul-de-sac and watched as the smoke was blasted away in a burst of air. Clean sightlines was something that he had forgotten existed, but now he wished the smoke had stayed a moment longer. Lances glittered in the faint sunlight. Pennants streamed on the conjured winds, flayed skin tattooed with the logo of a horned beast with black eyes. 10 across and deep back, wide and broad-shouldered lancers sat on insectoid beasts. The leading rider lifted a curved horn, 4 feet long and ivory, to its lips, and the haunting sound came out again. "Fucking kill him, Connie!" Del screamed, and the tank fired again. Heat suffused the air and the bolt crossed the distance in less than a blink of the eye. A wall of flame went up towards the sky and diffused in the atmosphere. A robed figure sat behind the wall of armored lancers, a cowl covering its features. A pale hand was stretched out from oversized robes, black manacles biting into flesh. Flame Guardian LVL. 19. Herald of the Damned LVL. 18. Gnull Rider Commander LVL. 21. Chapter 29. Arak had a moment to look at the monster that the Lancers rode. Insectal with emerald green carapaces, 6 legs ending with capped steel spikes that dug into the stone boulevard like it was cheese. The round head was eyeless and had a pair of waving antennae that twitched and shifted with every second. Mandibles clacked, coated in blood and with scraps of flesh dangling. The Gnull Riders lowered their lances, forming a wall of death as the horn cried out once more. Imperial soldiers backpedaled, fear crushing their morale as the echoing blast of the horn rolled over them like a blanket. The gnolls lunged forward, heating ground with a brutal pace, cutting the distance in a heartbeat. The second tank fired, desperate to blunt the wall of steel and chittering mandibles. The robed figure rose up in their saddle, hands swiping, and the tank's blast ricocheted up into the air to detonate harmlessly. Arak shoved Nevia to the ground and beneath Dale's tank, the rest of her squad following behind. Arak covered the edge of the tank, holding his sword to the sight as the lancers swept the field in a flood of death. Imperial soldiers were ran down, cut down, speared, and crushed. Arak struck a stray lance that was aimed at him, the momentum of the rider numbing his sword wrist as he diverted the blow. His return strike was slow and the sword scraped a layer off of the creature's thick shell, but no blood flowed. He had to duck behind the tank as the second wave of lances threatened to take his head. "We need to kill that guardian," Nevia said as she huddled in the shadow of the tank. Dell had dropped into the safe interior of the tank as it fired its secondary weapons into the massive lancers. The lancers' armor deflected most of the bolts and Neil simply ignored them, the bursts of heat scorching their shells but not piercing them. Arak looked to where the Fire Guardian rode, a cluster of higher-level lancers around them. The commander and the herald both rode at the front lines and had begun to spin in the wide cul-de-sac to begin the second charge. Scores of dead Imperials now mixed with the demons they had just finished killing. The lancers had lost one or two, their armored corpses laying, shining in the light. Arak nodded in agreement and looked for his spear. The sword didn't have the distance he needed to compete with the long weapons of the riders. He had last seen the spear wedged in a demon corpse and he saw it with a quick scan. The long spear was still sitting in the midst of a gory mess and Arak knew what he had to do. He brought up his status screen and saw the 3 levels he had earned. The 15 points sitting there. He dumped 5 into processing as the demons were moving in quick bursts of speed he had trouble keeping up with. Then another 2 into perception, and then the remaining 8 went to strength. Arak Bloodsworn LVL 13. Strength 41. Vigor 21. Durability 21. Perception 20. Processing 20. Aura of Bloodlust LVL 2. Spear Strike LVL 1. The world slowed down as his body pulsed. Blood flowing through his veins, infused with strength. Every limb trembled in anticipation as Arak lunged into the swirling mass of bugs and demons. He struck down a lancer, sword wedging in between the neck and shoulder and ripping the lancer off its mount. The gnull turned, mandibles clamping down on its former rider's legs as Arak dragged the demon free. The monstrous mount dragged the screaming lancer into its maw, crunching metal and bone with equal ease. Arak wrenched his sword free from the lancer's neck and left it there to be consumed, continuing into the fray. Screaming Imperials raced about, the few remaining officers trying to rally their troops. More Imperial troops were coming out of the broken-down line of houses, but it was a meat grinder of strafing lancers, firing small handheld casters into the mostly unarmored Imperial soldiers. Arak shoved a dismounted lancer off its feet, the armored figure not seeing him until Arak's shield was in its side and lifting it off its feet. The demon was smaller and more compact than the Hellspawn or Infernal soldiers, and Arak chopped down on it with a long sword. Arak split its armor like it was cheap tinfoil and demon blood ran fresh again as Arak stepped over it and picked up his spear. He looked about the lot and found the Guardian riding in its huddle of lancers near the hold Imperial troops were trying to force open. Both the tanks, and the remaining Imperial soldiers, were trapped inside of the cul-de-sac, with over 100 mounted lancers holding the line to prevent reinforcements from reaching them. Arak looked to where the lancers had ridden in from and his heart sank. Another company of foot soldiers, tightly packed together with more dried-skinned banners. Behind the packed rows was a knot of gnull riders, another of the Fire Guardians in the center. One problem at a time. He tracked the original Fire Guardian as they held the line, hands waving about to block the waves of Kestra fires from burning the gnull riders. Arak took a skip step and then the spear cut through the air as he threw with all his might. The extra energy and euphoria burning through him put extra emphasis on it. The freed sunlight reflected off the rare gray spear as it pierced the Fire Guardian's back. The hooded figure arched their back and froze, arms outstretched, essence fading away from its hands. The gnull riders were shocked as suddenly the cast fire hit them full force. Shining armor held for a moment, but then began to pierce, bodies slumping off of their mounts. Gnulls themselves thrashed about as the concentrated fire began to blacken their sides. Arak lifted his sword and looked about for the gnull rider commander, not caring about the rank disparity. The commander was whirling its bloody sword around, trying to gather its command to it. The herald blew its cursed horn again and the scattered lancers began to coalesce together. They were beginning to push back, to head towards the block of infantry protected by the other Fire Guardian. The whir of straining metal caught his attention and he looked at Dale's tank. Nevia was perched on the side, yelling into the hatch as the cannon pointed at the commander and herald. Arak smiled as the tank fired and the commander and herald disappeared in a flash of light. The haunting notes of the horn faded away and some of the panic that had been consuming the soldiers of the Empire faded, their commanders' voices suddenly piercing the fog that infected their minds. Nevia stood tall and proud on the top of her tank and roared, her voice soaked through with essence. "Form lines. Face front." Arak rushed to the tank, leaping atop of it to raise his shield just as bone spikes came flying at her. Bonusputters came scuttling to the sides of the infantry block. Hellspawn choked the skies as the burst of wind faded away and smoke began to choke the world again. The lancers scurried to the sides of the cul-de-sac, racing their mounts as tank fire and squad levels of fire targeted individual members. Most of the lancer company was still alive, but they were broken and disorganized. Imperial soldiers flooded through the broken houses, filling the gaps and tanking cover in the shadow of the two tanks. "Fucking trap. Kill the last guardian and we will break them," Nevia shouted into his ear. Arak nodded, still riding the high of pushing so many points into his stats. The tight blocks of infantry were marching forwards, spears first into pike formation. The guardian was waving their hands frantically to stop the caster fire, but bolts still streaked through. Arak picked up Nevia and set her down behind the tank again before turning his sight on the block of infantry coming down the way. The mass of infantry was nothing more than essence waiting to be collected. Arak stepped in front of the tank, sword on shoulder and shield raised as he began to advance. Chapter 30. Bones splintered against his steel, showers of off-white bone flung into the air as Arak picked up speed. He peeked over the edge of the shield and saw the line of spears facing him, tips steady as the line of infernal warriors marched forward. Arak felt his core stir as essence whirled through him, gathering strength as his aura spread out amongst the Imperial soldiers and began to infect the front lines of demons. He saw the shift in their stances, the fear beginning to blossom like a rot. The Imperials behind him roared, their cast of fire coming furious and hot as Arak charged in front of it all. A stray bolt dinged off his armor as he reached the leading edge of spears. His sword swept a spearhead away, while his shield battered another, leaving him a crease in the spear wall to push through. The tightly packed demons screamed in rage, in defiance, and in horror. Arak kicked out, his front leg shattering a demon's knee. He dragged his sword down the shaft of a spear, relieving the owner of its fingers, before he cut its belly open. He threw himself side to side, jostling the entire front row of demons as he continued to lash and kick, trying his best to free up room around himself to use the long's ward to full effect. The mounted lancers were a distance away, the flame guardian protected by the wall of armor as its arms danced in a frantic display to keep cast of fire away. Arak started through the ranks of demons, shouldering and tossing demons to the ground. Most of what he saw through the thin slit of his helmet were weaker demons, not a single one above level 10. The back row was a different beast. The lancers all lower teens and the final row of spear holders were slightly lower. A spear scraped his leg, a fist pounded ineffective against his shoulder blade, a knife tried to wedge itself in the gap of armor at the back of the knee. The demons pressed and shoved, the weight of the crowd threatening to tip him backward. They were too weak. His aura swelled as demon blood drenched him as he finally made enough room around himself to swing the sword. He slashed and hacked, moving forward one step at a time. The uncommon sword continued to scream in the air as it split flesh until a notification popped into his view. Synergy found. Sword of Discord and Or of Bloodlust. Fear effect doubled on all enemies. Arak laughed, his scarred throat making it sound like the crackle of gravel. Demons blanched and tried to back away from him, their weapons doing nothing more than scraping his armor as he marched over them. His laugh swelled, joining the music of the sword, mingling with the fear of the demons until Arak could see it. Essence flowed above their heads, filling the smoky clouds with a red energy tinged with yellows and violets. His speed increased and demons died in droves, their lines breaking as Arak rampaged through them. His direction was unwavering, his will undeniable, his existence violence incarnate. The honor guard shuffled around their charge, affected by the aura attack to a lesser degree. They backed their mounts up, and from behind, Arak could hear caster fire burning flesh. There was a range to the Flame Guardian skills then. Arak cut through the back line, taking an armament ahead from different demons, and then was facing the line of higher-ranked spearmen. 10 of them, all of them only a few levels below him. Arak's bellowing laugh dropped to a threatening rumble, the exhilaration of the fight slowing as he paced forward. The leader struck like a snake, energy wrapped around his spear in the same way Arak had used Spear Strike. Arak turned and twisted, letting the energy-wreathed blade flash by him. He moved faster than the demon and trapped the spear to his body by wrapping his sword arm up and over the spear and pinning it to his torso. He yanked the spear and the demon foolishly held on. The infernal soldier flew at him, its strength a pale shadow to the depths of Arak's monstrous power. Pale yellow eyes were wide with fear as Arak headbutted it, leaning down and forward to connect, the sound of breaking bone loud in the confines of his helmet as the demon was staggered backward. It released its spear as its clawed hands went to clutch at its ruined face, and Arak stabbed it through the belly, twisting and ripping the blade out of its side to block another attacker. The rest of the spear line sprang at him, skills coming in a fast flurry as Arak was forced to use his shield and sword in concert to survive. A spear strike hit his chest, Arak a second too slow to block, and pain burst in his chest, stealing his breath. His armor held, but now there was a small dent in the breastplate, when nothing else had managed to do more than scrape away the enamel of the rare grade armor. Arak lopped the offending demon's head off and then was staggered as a pair of blows hit his right knee. He managed to stay on his feet and kept his composure as he slashed back, cutting a furrow in a demon's thigh. It screamed and tried to back up, but Arak pounced. Forcing his tired legs to surge forward, he caught the spearman and hit it with the front of his shield and sent it sprawling as Arak dueled its partner. Another blow to the back, between his shoulder blades, and then another to his left hamstring. Arak snarled, pain and rage deepening his bloodlust as he cut down the demon he was facing. Arak spun on the ball of one foot and then in a smooth motion crushed downward with his other heel on the throat of the demon he had knocked down. 6 of the 10 demons were now dead or fled, the remaining 4 all arrayed in front of him in a thin imitation of their company's formation. The gnills were fleeing, their charge nestled between them. The scattered company of lancers had managed to regroup with them and they rode away in a force of several hundred, disappearing into the smoky chaos of the capital city without pausing. They had abandoned the foot soldiers and the song the sword and his aura made crushed what morale they had. The block of infantry collapsed and Nevia was there, her own sword slicing and cutting as she made her way to him. He turned his eyes back to the 4 remaining demons and leapt, clashing with them in a ring of steel on steel. 2 in the middle fell, one under his boots and the other as he ran the edge of his sword along its neck. The last 2 split apart, leaping far away from him. The one on Arak's right broke, turning and fleeing away toward where the Gnull riders had left. The one on the left lifted its spear up and roared in defiance to its fate. Nevia's sword burst from its sternum, the small officer appearing behind it as the higher-ranked demon staggered about. She withdrew her sword and let the demon fall to the ground before taking its head in 3 bloody chops. Arak! Her chest heaved as she gulped air. A few stray hairs were pinned to her sweaty and blood-spattered face. Arak looked about and saw the state of the Imperial soldiers. All of them were lost in the fervor of battle as they hacked and clawed apart the invaders with feral intensity. He looked up to see the thick cloud of essence above him. Releasing the aura was hard but instinctual. Reminiscent of climbing out of a warm bed on a cold morning. The cloud faded away and the Imperials slowly regained themselves as the tanks rumbled forward. They still had more blocks to secure until they reached Titus's square, but Arak's part was over. He had a ship to command. Chapter 31 Arak and Nevia's squad worked their way back towards the armory and Arak got to see the devastation wrought by their attack. Corpses piled high as supplementary Imperials pulled and stacked the dead, securing every piece of functional weaponry or armor that the demons had. Their blood sacrifice-fueled siege weapons were being dragged into the armory and Arak had to frown at that. There was no honor in those foul contraptions. It was better stored inside of the armory than outside of its walls though. There at least the demons could not reclaim or repair them to use against the Imperials. The surviving civilians, those who had been captives and those who had hidden in the rubble, raced toward the stained walls of the armory and the scant protection it offered. Eroc's battle high was fading, his heart slowing and the weariness of a long day settling. He was staring down a large number of announcements on the screen, but had little desire to deal with them. Nevia and her people trudged behind him, their feet nearly dragging in their exhaustion. All 10 of them were still alive, having used the cover the heavy tanks provided to their advantage. The wide walls of the armory were scorched and blackened, the once pristine white walls filled with cracks and carbon scoring, smoke already staining them gray. Eroc walked through them, only his own grim determination keeping his legs pumping as he entered the bustling hive of the outer courtyard. Hundreds if not thousands of civilians now sat or stood around in catatonic stupors. An equal amount were screaming and crying as the strain of the day broke free and expressed itself. Eroc shouldered past them all, most sliding away from his large figure as if he was a demon himself. "Lord Bloodsworn, you are quite a mess. I would advise cleaning your gear and self as soon as possible," Nevia whispered up to him. Eroc glanced down at his own arm and found she was right. He was caked and sticky, drying blood. Scraps of flesh stuck to his shield and both sword and spear needed to be cleansed as soon as possible. He looked up towards the scarred behemoth in the sky. In the darkening light of the hidden sun, the great warship was nothing more than a shadow in the smoke. The trailing lattice work of the floating docks, skeletal and menacing. Shapes flickered far up there, hellspawn and whatever else had crawled free of their portals. "Eroc, you live. Not that I doubted you'd survive, what with the heavy plate armor you're wearing, but it's good to see my suspicions confirmed," Prince Sam said. His own clothing was dirty and there was a smear of ash and blood across his forehead while his stained bandage was over one arm. "I have great news. We have taken many of the energy cores from the golems and fed them to Dull. He's been able to awaken several dormant systems, including our longer-range communications. Eroc, we have made contact with the palace." Eroc shoved by the parents, heading toward the small building that housed the stairwell that led down into the hill. Nevia shouted as did Samus, but Eroc was moving faster than any of them could easily keep up, long legs eating up ground as he raced away. He slammed through the doorway, choked full of people who got out of his way, and then began to descend. The heavy tread of his boots on the stairs was lost in the general chaos of the underground bunker, dozens of bodies moving up and down and shouting. Eroc found the right exit and headed toward the war room that they'd had their brief meeting in so long ago. Foy was there, haggard and gray as she leaned against a table. Dull floated to the side, a twisting blueprint of the armory. Other officers clustered around Foy, but they leapt away as Eroc came to a skidding halt at the sight of the projection in the center of the table. Lady Clara Turpin, the personal handmaid to their queen. A young woman with harsh cheekbones and a scar that ran the width of her forehead. Pale gray eyes that were hooded and sunken with exhaustion as she clenched a bloody sword in one hand. "Eroc? Is that you?" Her voice was tinny and far away and Eroc quickly grabbed at his helm, eager to rip it free. His gauntlets came next, freeing his fingers as he looked at one of the sworn guardians of the Queen. He flexed his hands a few times and then began to speak the silent tongue. "Queen? The Queen is fine, Eroc. The palace has many safeguards, most not known to the public and a few that weren't known to the nobility. She's leading the defenses on the West Wing as we speak. Eroc, we have a problem though. We are cut off, completely surrounded on all sides of the hill. This is the first time we've managed any type of contact outside of the palace's outer walls." "Orders?" Eroc asked. Lady Turpin straightened, a sad look crossing her face. It was a look Eroc knew. The look of someone ordering the death of a friend. "The portal above the Iron Cathedral. That creature is what is keeping us from breaking free. Every time one of the gates opens it throws that fire down upon the troops. 2 companies of the Royal Guard have died trying to get outside of the gates already. General Foy said you had an idea of fighting it, but Eroc, when we retreated, Prince Elmunkar and his personal guard rode to kill it. He had a company of 100 strong and they were well equipped. He was the third prince, Samus whispered behind him. Arak had been so caught up in his discussion with Lady Torpin he hadn't heard the young prince arrive. Prince Samus, it heartens us that you live and continue to serve. Clara turned back to Arak. Kill that creature, Arak, and close the portal. The scholars believe that is where the majority of these invaders are coming from. Now that you have freed yourself, General Flay, you are to rally every man, woman, and child who can wield a weapon. After Arak closes the rift, you will attack through the city and relieve the siege on the east wing. Princess Eloria holds, but they have taken heavy losses. Is she available to speak? Arak asked. Clara's face fell further and she shook her head. I am sorry, Arak. The battle goes on and twice she has ridden out to rally the men. She has a company of royal guard with her along with her personal guard from the north. She is safe as any out here. I could not risk pulling her away while she is needed. My duty is my honor. Arak stood, grabbing his helm and gauntlets, then his weapons. New fire burned in his gut as he turned and walked out of the bunker. There was no time to rest, not when his oaths were to be fulfilled. Chapter 32 The entryway to the floating docks had a pale yellow light emanating from them now. Several of the smaller energy cores harvested from the flesh golems had been inserted into ports along the doorway, and with a pneumatic hiss they parted for Arak as he walked up to them. Its hallway was dim but clean, the steel floor polished to a sheen, protected from the day's chaos by the heavy locks. An engineer LVL-7 was working, a heavy toolbox at his feet with several of the energy cores stacked around him as he tried to open up other doors. The woman had a thin line of grease across her head and she swore with the virulence of a sailor but with the vocabulary of a scholar. Behind Arak a trail of people followed after, muddying the floor with their ashen boots coated in blood. Lieutenant Nibia, still beside his elbow even though her mission was completed, and her squad of survivors. Prince Samus had managed to tuck himself into their number and was now exchanging lightning-quick verbal exchanges with Sergeant Constance. Rutledge and Julius had appeared and followed behind them quietly. Arak didn't mind the company as long as they didn't slow him. The engineer looked up and saw Arak then Samus. Her face paled as her hands suddenly trembled, threatening to drop the tool she was working with. She bowed her head violently enough that Arak thought she may have incurred whiplash. Are the elevators working to take us up to the docks? Navia asked without prodding. Yes. Nobody has gone up there though. I was waiting for an escort just in case anything had infiltrated the docks. Are you my escort? Her voice was thin and reedy, pleading that the Emperor's voice and an Imperial Prince weren't there for her. We are now. Open the doors. Constance, Rargard. Professors, it may be best if you wait till the pathway is secure. Julius shall shield me, Rutledge said with a thin smile. The other scholar paled and looked about with worry on his face. Arak had to restrain himself from tapping his foot as the engineer hurriedly shoved an energy core into the slot she had uncovered. The small elevator's door opened soundlessly and they all stared at it. Arak might fit in it. If he squeezed in tight. This is a personnel elevator. We haven't figured out how to open the service and loading bay elevators yet, the engineer explained. Arak shoved himself into the elevator, shield, sword, and spear all having to be set into a corner so he could wedge himself in it. Arak lifted a finger at the engineer and pointed to the thin sliver of room left in the elevator. The woman was visibly shaking as she stepped into the gap and turned around, her toolbox pressed tightly to her chest with the remaining energy cores inside of them. The elevator doors shut and they started upward. A speaker played something southern and brassy, the music frustratingly irritating. Arak waited a moment then reached over and ripped the speaker out of the corner of the elevator, letting the ruined metal fall to his feet. The engineer gulped loudly as the now silent elevator kept streaking upward. The doors opened and the woman bailed out without looking. Arak took considerably longer to unfurl himself, pulling his weapons out and readjusting them. The heavy kite shield on his left hand, the sword on his left hip, and the spear in his right hand. Arak turned about in the near pitch-black corridors and cursed the Imperials for their lack of hide. His head threatened to scrape along the top of the ceiling, and all of the doorways he could see in the dim depths were small and narrow. The elevator left, racing back down to continue ferrying people up to the docks. Arak nudged the engineer softly and the woman almost fell to the ground. She looked up at him, fright and pain writ across her face. Arak pointed to the deadlight housings and imitated his best shrug. It was hard when he was locked into a mountain of hard steel. Oh, the lights. Yes, I think it should be close by. There's a power junction and that's where the other housing spots appeared. Inside of a breaker box. Can you come with me? The last bit was nearly a whisper and Arak just nodded. She sighed in relief and took off instantly, still clutching her toolbox and the cores tightly. Arak followed after, twisting and stooping every time they came to a hatchway. The woman was much more suited for the tight confines and slowly started to outpace him, her focus on the job outstripping her fear of the dark. They entered a long hallway and kept moving forward when Arak heard a rustle of leather. He leapt forward, wrapping the woman up and covering her just as a wave of fire ignited in the tight hallway, consuming where she had been. His armor glowed, shield pulsing in the heat, but nothing affected the engineer. The flames disappeared and Arak uncoiled and lunged at where they had come from, his spear shooting into the darkness with a blur of deadly speed. He met resistance and pushed through it and a familiar screech echoed out. Not demonic. Something primal and old. It stirred his blood as memories of the hunt came flooding forward as something twisted and a curse was spat out. The curse was similar to the hacking, coughing, brutal language he had heard them speak. I'll turn the lights on. Keep it from frying me. Arak was too busy grappling with a slashing sword while what he had stabbed twisted and writhed on his spear. Something heavy banged into the wall and another cry came out as Arak ripped his spear free. A sword strike sent a shower of sparks off his helm, giving the lightning-quick impression of something large and scaly. Arak lunged forward again, stabbing twice more, each strike piercing flesh and eliciting another pained cry. Pressure and pain overwhelmed him suddenly and he was weightless, flying backward through the air to clang heavily to the ground. Arak had lost his spear, still embedded in what he had stabbed, and he rose up drawing the longsword just as the lights flickered on, hardly piercing the dark and creating a dark gloom. Pools of blood sat, dark in the light, where he had fought whatever it had been. His spear wasn't there though. A line of blood was smeared across the deck, leading deeper into the docks. The engineer came back around the corner and skidded to a halt at seeing the dented and bloody walls where Arak had briefly battled. Damn thing, I don't think I can get the lights any brighter, now without a bunch more of these. She lifted one of her remaining power orbs before continuing. Are we going to go and get your friends? She asked. Arak pointed toward where they had entered the docks and flicked his fingers in a shooing motion. She slowly turned and walked back the way they had come, glancing over her shoulder before turning and dashing away. Arak hunched over and prowled forward, his old instincts taking over. There was a hunt to be conducted and a spear to be retrieved. Chapter 33 Arak followed the streaks of rusty blood deeper into the docks, moving in a low crouch with the sword in front of him. Every step was careful as he looked over the multitude of entrances and exits that his prey could have taken. The docks were a warren of twisting halls and small rooms. He passed a pair of legs, one in the middle of the hall in the bright orange of a construction worker, and the other a deep violet sweatsuit that was propped against a corner. The walls were coated in the sticky gore, and Arak could taste the hints of violence still lingering in the air. Every breath was a harsh exclamation, loud in the silence of the haunted hallways. He stepped down and the ring of his boots on the metal was sharp as he looked around, waiting for the beast to come and confront him. The blood slicks were growing thinner, the creature's companion likely having assisted in stopping the blood loss from its wounds. He leaned down to look at the closest blood trail, wet and glistening. A drop of saliva hit the floor. Arak slowly peered up and saw the creature he had been stalking looking at him with hungry, yellow eyes. They moved together, Arak rising up, sword and shield in harmony as the creature skittered at him, jaws wide and fire gleaming in the back of its throat. The ball of fire washed over him, blinding Arak and stealing his breath as the superheated air burned. Weight slammed into him, knees buckled as he twisted and slashed, sending the Wyrm to the side in a deafening crash. Arak rolled, turning the force of his fall in backward momentum and rising to his feet in a fighting stance. A door wished open behind him and the demon came at him screaming a war cry as its short sword stabbed at Arak's neck. Pinned between the two, Arak attacked the rider, trusting in his armor to hold as he crossed blades with the small demon. Beast Tamer LVL 11. The demon looked different than those he had been slaying all day. Smaller and more delicate, with sharp cheekbones and a buttoned nose. Its ruddy red skin had black ink runes tattooed across the bridge of its nose and under its violet eyes. Thick iron-gray hair was chopped in a pixie cut while short fangs protruded from its mouth as it hissed at him in defiance. Arak slapped aside its sword with his shield and stabbed it through its thin leather armor, piercing its sternum and erupting from its back in a spray of pink blood. It coughed once and died as Arak put his big boot on its small chest and pulled the sword free to turn back to view the ream. Juvenile Wyrm LVL 10. It looked similar to the ice Wyrms he had hunted in the north. 6 legs on each side with 3 talon claws, a long sinuous body with dull brown scales and yellow eyes that gleamed with intelligence. Drool dripped from its mouth as it moved side to side like a snake did before it struck. Arak matched its movements, bobbing side to side with the sword ready to engage the nearly 20-foot-long monster. It exploded in a furor of movement, all talons and teeth, and Arak slashed and connected, parting scale like they were paper. Blood spilled on the deck in a loud splash, but the Wyrm's weight knocked him down and he hit the deck in a clang. The Wyrm screamed in his face as it tried to wrap around him, Arak's heavy body being slammed back and forth as the Wyrm coiled about. Its head twisted to look at him and Arak let go of his sword and slid his other arm free of his shield and wriggled both free of the tightening coils. Even through his armor he could feel the pressure mounting as the coils continued to tighten. Arak punched it in the face, right where the eye was, and was rewarded with its scream morphing into a yowl of pain. Arak grabbed at its thick neck with his other hand and squeezed, his fingers crushing small scales beneath in his clench. Heat blossomed all around him, sweat breaking out on his face as the Wyrm began to heat up. It hissed again, spittle spraying through his visor and clinging to his eyes as Arak growled in return, squeezing harder as he punched it again and again. Each titanic blow tore cuts through the scale until he finally connected and one of the dreadful yellow orbs popped into a spray of gelatinous flesh. The reaction was immediate and violent. It tightened enough that his armor groaned in response and Arak's breath fled him, forced from his diaphragm. Arak didn't relent in his crusade to crush the Wyrm's skull. He clung to its neck with a vice-like grip, refusing to allow it to move, as he hammered away like a blacksmith at an anvil. It snapped on his arm and dagger-like teeth broke on his rare great armor. Arak laughed, harsh and grating sounds that trembled up from his ruined throat as he ripped his arm free of the animal's now ruined mouth. It howled in pain, but Arak was merciless. Sweating from the heat of its body and breath coming in short pained gasps, he persevered. Minutes passed as they battled, the Wyrm trying to slash him with claws, crush him in its coil, and cook him by emanating heat, but Arak was stronger. His fist hit its ruined face again, where the eye used to be, and he was rewarded with bone splintering. Vigor flooded him, his weary limbs regaining their strength as he renewed his battering with precise focus. The Wyrm tried to get away, loosening its coils and beginning to crawl, but Arak clung with his one hand and hit with the other as he was dragged down the hull. His blows lacked leverage, but the misshapen skull was already broken and it only took 2 more hits to get the Wyrm to stop and spasm before it fell to the ground. Arak took a moment to catch his breath, laughter tugging free as he reveled in the aftermath of the fight. A hunt of an ice Wyrm would require at least a half-dozen hunters, and even then victory was not assured. To catch one in his hand and pulverize its skull with the other. He got to his feet and found the shield and sword discarded by the creature's unraveling nature and cleaned the sword before tucking it back in its sheath. He went past the dead demon and into the room it had ambushed him from and looked about. His spear was there, propped against a wall in the corner. The room was filled with other treasures that the Wyrm rider had procured. Energy cores, weapons, valuable metals, and other things that Arak couldn't identify. A bed was in the corner, and Arak stripped it of its sheet and grabbed the energy cores that had been piled in the corner and filled the sheet and twisted the cloth, turning it into a temporary bag as he grabbed his spear and left the room. The rest of the group should be here soon enough, and he needed them to watch over him as he took the newest level he had just earned. Chapter 34. Nevia stood with the engineer, her face stern as Arak came trudging back to them. The high of the fight was fleeting, his limbs heavy once again as exhaustion crept upon him to steal his strength. Lost in the smoke below them, the day's passage had been long and difficult, with more blood having been shed in a few hours than Arak could honestly comprehend. Julius peeked around from Nevia, and Rutledge pushed herself off of a wall as the rest of Nevia's squad had relief written across their faces. Samus just quirked an eyebrow when Arak handed his newly acquired knapsack to the engineer and signed crudely to Julius. Lord Bloodsworn has completed another level and needs a moment to strengthen himself, the professor said. Nevia didn't say anything, but her mouth was firm and there was anger in her eyes radiating outward with a warm fury. Arak Bloodsworn LVL 14. Strength 42. Vigor 23. Durability 23. Perception 20. Processing 20. The small burst of pleasure was just a temporary relief against his accumulating aches and pains, but it was relief nonetheless. The boost of vigor and durability would help him continue this marathon day, while a single extra point to strength just nudged him slightly further along. Should we go and find the ship that Dahl was talking about, or go straight towards the sword? Nevia asked, voice stiff and angry. Arak could understand that anger. It was his existence that had pulled her away from her unit, and he had ran off to chase a fight while leaving her to stew. He would invite her on the next hunt. To the sword, he signed to Julius, and the man relayed it. My apologies, my lord, the small engineer said. All eyes turned on her and she shivered at all the attention. What is it? Nevia barked. If the entrance to the old girl is as bad as the entrance into the docks was, it's going to take me some time to open her up. Maybe an hour. Arak struggled to keep his temper at the newest delay. A guard on the engineer. The rest to the secondary ship, Arak ordered, and Julius nodded as he told the rest. Podky, Ramos, you two are with. What's your name? Laura Basson, ma'am. Podky and Ramon, go with Laura and get the door open. Nothing touches her, you got me? Yes, ma'am, the two assigned soldiers said, both nodding and then quickly leaving with Laura tucked behind them. Constance, rearguard. My prince, I'd humbly suggest putting yourself in the middle of the formation with the professors. My squad, envelopment. Lord Bloodsworn has led. Nevia's 4 soldiers posted up, 2 to a side of the professors and prince, forming a small column 3 wide, while Constance and her last 2 soldiers slunk to the back of the formation. Nevia took up position in front of her squad while Arak was moving forward. He made it through 3 intersections before stopping. He didn't know where he was going. He turned to look back and saw a few smug smiles that were quickly stifled. Professor Rutledge cleared her throat twice before speaking. Take the next left, Arak. Follow it straight, and then there is a ladder we will have to climb if the elevator isn't working. Arak nodded and moved without another sound. If there had been any energy left over for embarrassment, he may have felt a tinge of it. He was paying attention and heard a few snickers behind him. He was certain it was the prince. The hall had no grisly decorations, being rather clean and bare, but Arak didn't let that make him lower his guard. There were plenty of spots that one could be ambushed from in the tight confines of the docks. The trip passed peacefully and they found the elevator they needed worked, though it moved slowly. It was larger than the one they had took up, all of them managing to squeeze in even if Arak was pressed tightly into a corner and with his arms up to touch the ceiling to make a bit of extra room. Smells dreadful in here. Arak, when we have a moment, do be a dear and bathe. You were coated in. Well, several things, Rutledge said as she leaned on her cane, having a small bubble of space around her. Arak sniffed and could smell little beyond his own odor of stale sweat and body heat in the helmet. He had coated his exterior in several beings through the course of the day, and there was the trip into the sewer monster. His armor would need a good scrubbing. The doors slid open and the entire elevator fled, moving swiftly to escape the close confines and spreading out as they stared at the partially open hatch in front of them. The words over the hatch were written in bright red paint. Warning, construction in progress. Be alert. Danger. Now they tell us, Constance muttered under her breath, and there was a round of dry chuckles as Iraq stepped up to the stuck hatch and wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. Metal strained for a moment, then something gave way with an audible shriek and the hatch swung out to them. A bar had been wedged in the door, a crude attempt at a barricade right behind it. There were no signs of violence even if the barricade had been abandoned. Iraq ducked his head and walked through the hatch and past the mound of boxes strapped together and began moving across the construction yard. There should be a new possible spirit here, born from a ship's AI. The dockyard here was a long and wide tunnel with poor lighting and wide doors. Scaffolding and abandoned equipment lay everywhere, as if dropped in the middle of their work. Still no signs of violence. Second berth Iraq, on the right. The one with the doors already open, Rutledge supplied. Iraq nodded and shuffled his weapons, getting a firm grasp on them. There was something off-putting about this. The air was wrong, the stillness of it a warning of sorts. Iraq tread through the wide portal and into the partially constructed ship. Every portal was open and the lighting was only the faintest red light coming from somehow still functioning emergency lighting. The pallor cast across the polished steel of the ship was haunting and macabre, and his spine tingled as he looked about, every nerve on edge. Something is fucked here, one of the soldiers muttered. Constance hissed at him and they all lapsed into silence again. No, the soldier was right. Something foul is here. Iraq, be on guard. Rutledge barked at him, the sudden shattering of silence unnerving a soldier who bit out a cry of fear and surprise. They kept moving, each step taking them deeper into the steel skeleton, whose shape only hinted at a future that would not be seen. The bridge was coming up, mounted near the front of the ship with wide windows all around it, letting in the scenes from the world below. They crossed into the bridge and the tension had grown so thick that Iraq could have sliced it with his spear. Sweat was trickling down faces and hands shook as they looked about with worry in their eyes. Oh, no. You're here, a voice wailed in despair. Chapter 35. A floating light shimmered into existence, blue-white and stark against the blood-red lighting. The mote of light slowly expanded outward. Iraq watched as the ball of light grew, bones at first until a young dragon's skeleton was staring at them. Then tendons and muscles, blood and veins, then flesh and scales. A pair of stubby horns emerged from its head, lightning dancing around them as aqualine blue eyes formed. An eastern dragon, with a long sinuous body with a pair of long arms with flexible finders capped with sharp talons. It didn't have wings as their heavier but more compact western siblings had, but rather danced on the air currents, moving with the fast wiggling of a snake. Gray frills ran down its back and its scales were like blues, whites, and grays. You have doomed yourselves. It wailed, shaking and trembling as it whirled in tight circles. Doomed? It repeated, voice high-pitched and keening. Is it broken? One of the soldiers asked. Spirit of intellect. Rare. The only information on the small dragon that Iraq could discern with a glance. He looked back over to Rutledge, who thumped up to them and peered at it. The spirit stopped its keening cry and stopped in midair to look at the old woman. Strange. I can't see anything about him, Rutledge murmured. Iraq looked at the old woman and for the first time saw the strands of essence around her eyes. Unlike when others used the power, this use was subtle, just thin tendrils emanating from her eyes. I don't want you peering into me. The small dragon squeaked. Why are we doomed? Samus cut in, leaning around the old professor to look at the spirit. There is a creature on this ship. When I woke, the ship was staffed with many people, but as I became cognizant, they were snuffed out. By... Samus said. Rutledge was still peering intently at the spirit, frown increasing in both size and depth. It's in the loading bay, but I don't know what it is. There is something there preventing me from entering. That's where all the crew headed to when it started. "Arak, are you going to kill it?" Samus asked. Arak stared at the prince. What else was he supposed to do? Arak turned to Nevia and invited her to join him with a few shorthand signs. Julius leaned over and whispered what he asked, and Nevia nodded. "My prince, will you be staying here?" Nevia asked. "No. I will go and find my subjects, and if we can free them, then I will endeavor to do so." "Professors, I wish for you to stay here then. Constance and Bandu, stay here with the professors. Keaton, you're with me. Stick with your battle partner. Lord Bloodsworn, Prince Samus, we are ready," Nevia said as she finished rearranging her small team. "Arak, I believe you'll wish to lead the way," Samus said, waving back the way they had come. Arak stood there and then looked at Julius and asked him where the hangar was. The professor nodded and asked the dragon. "Lord Bloodsworn wishes to know the exact location of the hangar." "Out the hallway and to the elevator. Final level, button is labeled H," the spirits replied instantly. Arak nodded and started to trek out. The elevator was small like everything else, and Arak entered it without looking at the others. Nevia squeezed herself into a nook that Arak didn't take up and clicked the button to take them down to the hangar. The doors shut and Nevia looked up to him. "My lord, it is my job to protect you. I know you are stronger than us, but my job, my mission, is to escort you and keep you alive to serve the throne. I can't do that if you go rushing off every time something catches your interest. I ask that you wait for a moment or three so we can accompany you." Arak nodded instantly. He had his own thoughts of that as well. She had lost most of her command following him, and this was the least he could do for her. He wouldn't stop his hunting as long as it didn't pull him away from his overall mission. Better this way anyways. If you die, then it's almost assured that we will all be dead. Better to die by your side than report the death of an iron ring bearer. The elevator stopped and didn't open, Nevia not hesitating as she flowed out of the elevator with her sword drawn. Arak left the elevator and he could swear that the entire thing lifted up as his feet left the elevator. Nevia looked at him and he sighed as he waited for the elevator to return with the rest of the team. He looked about while they waited. The elevator had deposited them outside of a massive blast door of polished steel. The wide expanse of metal was decorated in strange glyphs, similar to what the sacrificial cannons had outside of the armory. Paint had been used instead of blood, black as tar and still wet. They seemed to pulse and wiggle as Arak looked at them. The doors to the elevator opened up and the rest of the team came out. They had all managed to squeeze themselves into the space and looked relieved to come out of it. "Well, that's disturbing," Samus muttered as he stared at the doors. Arak nodded in agreement before walking over to the door. The closer he got, the worse the feeling of being an invader grew. It was a feeling he should leave, an instinct as old as time that told him this was dangerous. He stopped inches from the door, the glyphs growing in size until they dominated his vision. Behind him, the mutters and curses of the rest of the party was fading away as if they were walking away. Each brutal line of the glyphs, the way the paint clung to the steel, the way it absorbed the light. His breath caught in his chest as he stared at it. The world faded away as he fell inward into the darkness. A hiss of air and then the darkness was sliding away and Arak could see in front of him, but it was obscured like a haze in both mind and eye. A creature stood there, gaunt and with a bulbous head and delicate fingers. Red dripped from its fingers as a wide smile spread across its face, showing off its thin needle-like teeth. Arak wanted to raise his spear and slay it, but his arms weighed more than the world itself. Every breath was a challenge. Every heartbeat a strain. Every thought moving through molasses. "Ah! More ingredients. Excellent. Enter." Its voice was the rasp of steel on stone, and Arak's feet moved without him thinking it. The hangar was decorated with cocoons, wet and glistening. They hung suspended from the ceiling and draped all the way to the floor. Gray-green and thin, he could see shapes moving inside of them, twisting and churning, shadows straining for freedom. So many lost, but more shall rise. Our lord is a resourceful lord, he wastes not, the creature kept talking as the rest of the party walked into the hangar. The doors clanged shut as Arak stood entranced by the cocoons even as the haze around his mind was breaking away. You shall become something more. Yes. More. A great creation. A great tool. Its whispery words were dreadful, sliding down Arok's spine like a stiletto. His hands clenched tight, straining under the pressure on his body. The heft and solid feel of the spear in his hand offered him assurance and grounding. A terrible tearing sound reverberated across the hangar, the sound of cloth tearing, but wet and visceral. Talons speared through the cocoon and forced it open, then a shape came sliding out in a spray of blood to slide across the hangar. Chapter 36. The creature rose to its feet slowly, limbs trembling as it slipped forward. Blood sluiced off its slick green carapace. Bug-like black eyes glistened wetly as a thick, pointed black tongue lashed out of its wide mouth, whipping back and forth wildly. It lurched awkwardly and trilled loudly, piercing and sharp as it looked about the hangar. Yes. Much different. A good first specimen for my lord's army. I shall be rewarded richly. The demon's halting speech drove nails down Arok's spine as he struggled to move. Behind him he heard a grunt, and then Samus's rich voice was barking out, each word a strain. We are people of the Empire. Warriors of the Empire. Our hearts are incorruptible. Our will unstoppable. We shall not yield. Arok watched as essence flowed about, floating on the air, propelled by the prince's words. Oh. A royal class? A spell then. Inspire. The demon stopped and waited. Arok could feel the depths the black paint had dragged him down begin to weaken. Arok gripped his spear harder, feeling the tension in his knuckles as they popped. The cords of power that held him down began to fray and Arok strained, forcing himself to try to move, even just 1 inch. A pity you are not more developed. A truly magnificent beast you would have become. Arok moved. His spear rose up by half an inch. The deadly point turned to aim at the grotesque creature that was lurching about. His vision was filled once more with information as he looked at the monster. Alchemical Abomination LVL. 12. Arok turned his eyes and looked at the demon that had caught them. It was still peering at Samus with undisguised interest, leaning over and peering at the prince with a leer on its face. Dark Alchemist LVL. 19. Arok stepped forward, a single step. The ring of his foot on the metal hanger rang out and the alchemist turned to look at him. Its eyes widened in shock and it whirled to run away, its steps slow and awkward. Kill the soldier. Spare the rest, the alchemist rasped, pointing at Arok. The creature stopped its wagging and turned to look at him. It dropped its asymmetrical shoulders and lunged forward in a blitz of speed. Talons lashed against him, scratching his armor in a spray of steel, the creature's weight staggering them both until Arok's still unwieldy knees buckled and they fell to the ground. Every passing heartbeat more of his strength returned to him, the lethargy that had clung to him dissipating. Arok wedged his knee up and into the creature's stomach, the chitinous carapace failing to yield as Arok pushed up. The abomination soared over his head and he surged to his feet, his aura beginning to spread out as his heart beat with rage. Arok dashed in, not letting the creature escape him, stabbing it through its leg as it rose wobbly to its feet. Its knee shattered in a spray of yellow goop and the creature raised its bulbous head to scream. Arok backed up and stabbed it through its fat head, popping it like a rotten fruit. He whirled to find the alchemist hadn't gotten far, its limping gait not fast enough to escape him. Arok threw the spear and watched as the blade flashed across the hangar to pierce the alchemist's stomach. The demon cried out, screaming shrilly, as it fell and slid across the hangar. The rest of the team broke free at the alchemist's scream, gasping and turning their weapons to the demon as it slowly tried to escape even with Arok's spear in its stomach. Arok walked over to his team and they clustered about him, all of them getting ready to go and finish off the demon. There was a rage in their eyes, their will having been stripped away from them. Navia's hand was trembling and a tendon was toned against her neck as she glared down at the demon. Samus was pale and sweaty, eyes wild and large in his skull as he stalked forward, drawing his own long curved blade. The sound of ripping cocoons filled the air. Arok turned and saw the scores of fleshy cocoons broke apart in a deluge of blood and abominations. They scuttled about like insects, rising up to their feet with dark eyes. All of them were low level, barely past 10, but there were dozens of them. Nevia's soldiers didn't hesitate to fire. Caster bolts searing and breaking the abominations in a flash of heat and fire. It took 2 to 3 bolts to pierce the reflective carapaces, none of the creatures reacting as they were burned down. Kill them all, the alchemist rasped. The abominations launched themselves without hesitation and Arak stepped forward. He pointed toward the dying alchemist and Samus bounded toward the alchemist, sword raised up and over his head. Arak killed the first of the bug-like abominations, its shell burned black from caster fire. Yellow blood splashed the ground as Arak spun, sword screaming through the air as he kept cutting and slashing. They were wheat before the thresher and Arak didn't stop as he cut. His aura spread out, filling the hangar as they fought the abominations. Arak spun his sword in a tight circle, cleaving one of their legs off at the knee and another's arm at the elbow. More and more of the cocoons ripped apart the hangar filling with the abominations. Now, Prince Samus. Kill it now. Nevia screamed as her sword lengthened and sliced apart an abomination in half in a flash of essence. Arak crushed an abomination with his shield, it crunching and splattering across him in a spray of putrid yellow. Die, monster! Samus screamed and then the hangar went silent. The abominations stopped moving, frozen in their steps. Arak risked looking over his shoulder and seeing Samus standing above the headless alchemist. Is that it? Are they just not going to keep moving? One of the soldiers asked. Arak stabbed one of the motionless monsters. It collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Essence filled him, but there was a bitter taste in his mouth. Killing defenseless monsters brought no joy to him. He turned and walked away from them as the soldiers fell upon them with knives and boots, finishing them off quickly. Arak watched as Essence gathered around one of the soldiers, who whooped excitedly. He had never seen the exact moment when someone leveled, but the burst of Essence was unique. Arak walked through the forest of cocoons, looking for anything that had been unobserved. Each of the fleshy pods were wilting, growing soft and drooping towards the ground. In the center of the hangar there was a pile of goods. Clothes, boots, tools, mementos, rings, and the other sundry artifacts of daily life. Arak looked at the abandoned goods and at the abominations. A horror sank through him. This went beyond death. Beyond dishonor. This was an unmaking. A twisting and perversion of what once was. Arak marched back in through the rotting cocoons, stomping up to the alchemist and raising his foot above the head and pulping it across the hangar with a powerful stomp. He whirled on the corpse and grabbed it by its hands and paused. The hands were long and delicate and clean. Arak dropped the creature and began to search. The hangar was a large cube and didn't take long, but no matter how he looked and what he moved, he couldn't find any black paint. Tope continued,